For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe.
Zep Tepi. It's a term you will have no problem finding discussions about here on the internet. From alternative archaeology proponents to New Age gurus, you will hear a lot about it. It's sold as a fundamental concept of ancient Egyptian mythology.
It is obvious that he is a marker of time, but the time that he really tells is the first time, the beginning of time, Zep Tepi, when the Lion King on earth looked at the cosmic lion and the sun in the sky at 11,500 BC.
The Zep Tepi from the ancient Egyptian language means first time, and it is generally connected to the myth of Osiris. My studies started in the effort to confirm the existence of a last civilization which lived on the planet in the ancient time. The same civilization, in my opinion, that built the pyramid all around the world, not only in Egypt. And the timeline is 36,400 before Christ, when the monument of Giza and the sky were perfectly aligned, according to the Thoth's Hermetic concept, as above, so below.
In the ancient chronicles, Zep Tepi is described as a time of divine reign. These 9 gods and their celestial kin ruled for thousands of years, walking amongst man and shaping the world in their image. They were teaching man and giving us tools to evolve. However, some claim there were those amongst them that were genetically enhancing man through procreation and genetic manipulation.
These wildly creative twists on an Egyptian term have made Zep Tepi into a carnival of pseudo-history. Ironically, if you studied Egyptian hieroglyphs, you're far less likely to have bumped into the name. It turns up rarely in inscriptions across Egypt's 3,000-year history. Today you're going to see Zep Tepi in context, perhaps for the first time, and learn why this little Egyptian expression was never about a historical time period, but about something far more fundamental. In the original Egyptian, you'll see Zep Tepi spelled usually in one of 2 ways. Because the exact pronunciation is not known for certain, as hieroglyphs often leave out vowel sounds, in the scholarly literature, you will usually see it transliterated as you see here. In Middle Egyptian, Tepi, which is the adjective, comes second, and it means first. Zep, the noun, means occasion or time, so the literal translation is first time or first occasion. Now yes, it can be used generically, and is, to simply mean the first time that something happens. But there were more common ways for the Egyptians to express the first time something happened, so this expression isn't seen a whole lot. Now that we know Zep Tepi simply means first occasion, let's see how these hieroglyphic signs make their way through Egyptian religious writings over 3,000 years. I consulted the Thesaurus Linguae Aegyptiae, TLA for short, to search for every occurrence of the term or any of its forms in Egyptian inscriptions and manuscripts. It knew of 75 occurrences in everything from quarry graffiti and coffin text spells to temple dedications and official genealogies. In addition, I found 2 more that the TLA missed, which are at the Temple of Edfu, and there may be a handful more there, but it was hard for me to tell as I don't have access to the complete inscriptions. We're hovering at around 80 occurrences of the term in the entire Egyptian corpus, and this is a very low number. Moreover, if we take out the clearly generic ones, there are 65 instances of the term in 46 total sources. So the first thing to note about Zep Tepi is that it is rather rare in Egyptian writings. What I found is that our earliest attestations of the term are in reference to the Sed festival, a celebration of the king's renewal of power, held usually after 30 years of rule. On the cliffs of Jebel el-Asr in Nubia, quarry scribes who lived in the 5th dynasty under King Sahura scratched this phrase, literally, first occasion of the genuine Sed festival. That's the oldest instance I could find. A century later, under Pepi I in Dynasty 6, quarry workers at Hatnub used the same formula. Both inscriptions tie Zep Tepi to the Royal Jubilee, as it is sometimes called. Nothing cosmic yet, just a call back to the first Sed festival. And this usage occurs past the Old Kingdom too. Royal Jubilee formulas use the phrase, first occasion of his Sed festival, too. So far, this is all generic. I suppose one could make an argument that the phrase could point back to the very first said festival of Osiris in primeval times, but there's no explicit mention of this, and Zep Tepi is certainly not used in these cases as the name of a time period. The term also drifts into metaphor and prestige. Priests and officials call themselves descendants of the dignitaries of the first time, weaving their offices into creation's original act. Temples, too, mark the first occasion this sanctuary stood, with the same phrase. However, it's still possible to interpret these as referring to the beginning of Egyptian government or temples without it going back to the time of creation. But let's consider the instances in which Zep Tepi definitely does, or probably does, refer back to primeval times. We have a couple of instances in the Middle Kingdom. The coffin text. This is coffin text spell 640, which contains the phrase, on the first occasion of seeing. Here the term shifts from festival to afterlife ritual, preparing the deceased to re-enter the primordial moment. The knot around me was tied by Nun, who witnessed that first time of seeing, before any of the gods had yet come into being. Notice first that the phrase of seeing is attached directly to Zep Tepi in much the same way as first occasion of the said festival was earlier. However, in this case, we know we are speaking of primeval times. It's talking about creation, but Zep Tepi is still being used in a descriptive sense here, and not as a proper name for the period. Keep in mind that there are texts from the Old Kingdom, most notably the Pyramid texts, that speak of primordial times and the dawn of creation, which later will be associated with the Zep Tepi. But so far, the term Zep Tepi is not being used to describe that time. In the New Kingdom, scribes distilled the phrase into a single term Q. You see Zep Tepi standing alone. You also find Zep Tepi in the Amduat and magical papyri, everywhere the soul, or magician, needs to invoke creation's dawn. Not every reading from my list is super clear, but I assume that any that present the term in isolation, or in a mythological context, with no attached noun, like said festival qualifying them, function as unqualified first-time labels for the primeval period. So this list basically shows that the shift to using Zep Tepi as a standalone first-time name doesn't really coalesce until the New Kingdom, and that in the Ptolemaic era it's firmly fixed as a proper name in both Edfu and Opet festival inscriptions. But what did the ancient Egyptians imagine actually happened at that primeval first time? Let's walk through what the texts themselves reveal. Several texts insist that deities themselves came into being during Zep Tepi. For example, we read, "The gods of Osiris' retinue are those who came into being with him in the primeval time. I have come before you, great falcon, motley-plumed Horus, Behedetite, great god, sky lord, I bring to you my heart, given its place. I have inhaled life according to your path. You are the godliest god who came to be in the first time." The verses in these texts frame the primeval as the time when deity and land first sprang to life, and the sphere of the scarab emerged from them for the first occasion, unfolding into a lotus blossom in which the divine child appeared as a joyous event. This image of the scarab beetle as both sun disk and creator child is the archetypal first event that generates life and light. Coffin text 640, which I mentioned earlier, describes how the knot around me was tied by Nun before the gods had come into being. That primordial knot tying is a metaphor for binding chaotic waters and inaugurating cosmic order. Other spells go so far as to credit Gold Horus with forming mankind at Zep Tepi. In every later funerary, magical, and jubilee context, Zep Tepi becomes the template. Whether you're renewing a temple, celebrating a said festival, or guiding a soul through the underworld, invoking the first time is how Egyptians tapped the creative potency of that original moment. But out in the wild world of YouTube and pop history books, Zep Tepi has grown into more than the ancient Egyptians could ever have imagined. As best as I can tell, the story started in 1960 with a book called Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egypt by Robert Thomas Rundle Clark. Rundle Clark was a British Egyptologist, actually, and from what I can tell, a pretty good one. He died relatively young and never finished his magnum opus about the origin of Osiris worship, but he did put out this short book designed for the popular market. And here within it, we find the words that served as kindling for the fire that would start later. The book provides a fascinating glimpse into Egyptian myths, particularly those associated with Osiris, Horus, and creation, but near the end, we find this statement. The basic principles of life, nature, and society were determined by the gods long ago before the establishment of the kingship. This epoch, Tep Zepi, the first time, stretched from the first stirring of the high god in the primeval waters to the settling of Horus upon the throne and the redemption of Osiris. All proper myths relate events or manifestations of this epoch. Wait a minute. Tep Zepi? I don't think it's a typo, because he writes it the same way in the index. Early Egyptological conventions were heavily shaped by German scholarship. Many of the standard grammars and lexica of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were in German, and they sometimes rendered Egyptian constructions with German word order or pronunciation cues. Clarke almost certainly leaned on those when he was assembling his own English-language translations in the 1950s, so I'm surmising that his pronunciation is influenced by this. But the point is that these words give us the earliest modern articulation in the public sphere of a name for this mythic epoch. This 1960 treatment predates R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz and John Anthony West, making Clarke arguably the first modern author to name and define Tep Zepi as an epoch, even if he didn't say it was a real historical age. Interestingly, Rundle Clarke explicitly frames Tep Zepi not just as creation, but as the span from creation, the high god emerging, through Horus's enthronement and Osiris's redemption. Not all Egyptian creation myths are consistent about this, but Rundle Clarke interprets this epoch as including the rule of Osiris over the earth. From what I have seen in the instances of the appearance of the term, the texts say that Zep Tepi was the occasion when the gods came into being and when humans were created. It is the story of creation. I could find no clear evidence of it being the time when Osiris ruled humanity and taught the arts of civilization. It may be that Rundle Clarke is tying in other myths with Zep Tepi, besides just the ones carrying that name. In later myth cycles and Greek retellings, Osiris is portrayed as a culture hero who ruled Egypt and taught agriculture and gave laws and civilization to humans. But those stories are never tied to Zep Tepi itself in the Egyptian corpus. They belong to the Osiris cycle, and they are set after the creation stories. Whatever the case, it would be apparent by anyone reading Rundle Clarke's book that while he connects Tep Zepi with a genuine golden age of Osiris's rule, he does so only in the sense of mythic drama. He doesn't see this as literal history. Tracing the conversation in the alt history circles, I couldn't find the term come up again until 34 years had passed. In 1994, Robert Bauval teamed up with Adrian Gilbert to write The Orion Mystery. There they introduce Tep Zepi, Rundle Clarke spelling, as a real historic age. For the Egyptians whose civilization preceded the Greeks and the Hebrews, the first golden age, when gods fraternized with humans, was called Tep Zepi, which translates loosely as the first time. In Egyptian religious texts, we often hear of the first time, when Osiris ruled Egypt during a first golden age. Bauval and Gilbert cite Rundle Clarke as their source, but the difference here is that Bauval and Gilbert speak of Tep Zepi as a real historical period. Bauval inherits Clarke's term, slots it into his star religion theory, and crystallizes the myth into reality. Well, then how did it get changed from Tep Zepi to Zep Tepi? That happened only a year later. In 1995, Graham Hancock cast a wide net with his book Fingerprints of the Gods. He flipped the name to Zep Tepi and cemented it in best-selling pop history. All the most ancient records and traditions of Egypt spoke of such events and associated them with the epoch during which the gods had ruled on earth, the fabled first time, which was called Zep Tepi. So Hancock must have somehow figured out that Zep Tepi is closer to how the Egyptians may have pronounced the term than Tep Zepi. But it would appear that he is responsible for popularizing this term with his usual cinematic flair. Then the following year, 1996, Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock teamed up to publish the book Keeper of Genesis, and there is considerable discussion of Zep Tepi in it. Interestingly, while giving credit to Rundle Clark for this knowledge, when quoting him, they change Tep Zepi to Zep Tepi without telling the reader. They also interpret Clark as speaking of Zep Tepi as a real period in history. Sure, Clark uses the word epoch to describe Tep Zepi, but this does not necessarily mean historical reality, especially in the context he's using it. Rundle Clark's book is titled Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egypt. He explicitly sets out to interpret ancient Egyptian ideas as mythological archetypes. When Clark uses terms like epoch, he does so within a symbolic and mythological framework. He describes an idealized mythical time, a symbolic age that Egyptians ritually invoked. Bauval and Hancock's interpretation of Clark takes his words out of their original context. But Bauval and Hancock reason this way. The ancient Egyptians spoke of the time of the gods, Zep Tepi, literally the first time, with the unshakable conviction that there had indeed been such an epoch. In other words, they believed that Zep Tepi had been an actual historical event. Here's the issue with that reasoning. Ancient Egyptians did not separate myth and history in the same way that we do today. They viewed events described in myth, especially creation events, as eternally true rather than historically factual. To Egyptians, the primeval event described by Zep Tepi was real but not necessarily historical in our modern sense. Instead, it was a religious and symbolic truth, continuously reaffirmed through rituals. This is why they were okay with contradicting creation stories. Historically speaking, they were spiritually true, so they all were good to them, even if the events didn't coincide. In every ancient Egyptian source we've examined, the texts never provide dates, tangible locations, or human witnesses to Zep Tepi, which is a contrast to their historical texts. They describe mythic realities, like the emergence of gods from primeval waters, or the unfolding of a lotus blossom containing the divine child. These are archetypal, timeless images, clearly mythological. Bauval and Hancock's reasoning conflates religious conviction and symbolic truth with historical reality. Their assertion that the Egyptians saw Zep Tepi as an actual historical event is incorrect and represents a serious misunderstanding, or misrepresentation, of the Egyptian mindset. I've heard it said that John Anthony West was one of the early proponents of Zep Tepi in the popular sphere, but I could find no mention of it in his main book, Serpent in the Sky, published in 1979. Mind you, he talks about themes associated with Egyptian creation and proposes a lost epoch long ago, but no use of the term Zep Tepi. He doesn't bring it up in the 1993 documentary Mystery of the Sphinx, nor did I find it in his book, The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, published in 1996, the same year that Bauval and Hancock published Keeper of Genesis. West delves deep into Egyptian mythology in this book, and I can find no mention of Zep Tepi in it. He even has a glossary in the back with many Egyptian mythological terms, and no Zep Tepi. If he had been talking about it prior to 1996, I would expect it to be in this book. So I think it more likely that he did so after 1996, in talks and on tours. It was mostly in the early 2000s that it became commonly mentioned in alt history discourse, and around then, the New Age movement picked it up. In a recent interview on Joe Rogan, well-known Egyptologist Zahi Hawass expressed ignorance about the term Zep Tepi.
Tell me about Zep Tepi.
What's Zep Tepi? What's this?
You never heard about... Have you heard about about the King's List, right? The old King's List that goes back 30,000 whatever years.
Who said that?
You never seen it? It's not in hieroglyphs?
This is not true.
It's not true?
All. No. This is a speculation from people who knows nothing about history. There is nothing King List dated back 30,000 years ago at all.
So why do people keep saying that?
Because they don't know.
Zep Tepi refers to the first time or the first occasion.
Who said that?
This is an AI. It refers to a mythical golden age of Egypt where gods lived on earth and civilization was in its infancy. This period is often associated with the beginning of creation and the establishment of societal structures. Have you've never heard of that before?
No, and this is not true.
What do you mean it's not true? I mean, I'm getting this off of...
It never happened at all.
Okay, I'm not saying it happened. I'm just saying that this is something that's referred to.
I never heard about it.
Zahi Hawass's unfamiliarity with Zep Tepi is perfectly understandable, and in fact rather telling about how specialized the term really is. His work centers on tombs, pyramids, mastabas, field archaeology, not the minutiae of ritual language. Yes, he has an understanding of Egyptian creation myths, but most of those myths don't mention the term. Considering the rarity of the word in the Egyptian corpus, even seasoned Egyptologists who focus on archaeology, monuments, and broad historical narratives, like Hawass, may never have encountered it, and even less so, that pronunciation. Yet alternative history defender Dan Richards confronted Hawass about this on the Piers Morgan show.
When you were on Joe Rogan, you said that you didn't know what Zep Tepi was. And I figured I would give you a chance. I would imagine as the premier Egyptologist in the world, you do know the Egyptian creation myth. Would you mind just explaining it to us real quick so that to kind of vindicate yourself and show the world you do know what Zep Tepi is?
No, I mean, I know about the ancient Egyptian creation, but maybe I don't know this term. But what
Okay,
I'm saying, what this has to do with what we are discussing now.
Oh, it's very important because, I mean, it's the ancient Egyptian creation myth involves the primeval mound, right? And this is a symbolic bend.
Exactly.
This is something you're going to see all over the ancient world. So that term Zep Tepi is you see it in Egyptian without the vowels, but it's the Egyptian creation myth. So it's kind of important. It's a very important lens to use when you're interpreting these artifacts. So when you were on Joe Rogan and he asked you what it was, and you said you didn't know what it was, that. So honestly, if you wouldn't mind, it's a good chance to vindicate yourself. No,
I teach the Egyptian creation, but I'm saying this term that you're talking about, I never heard of it. Maybe it is not in, I never heard it in the world of Egyptology. Maybe it's between the others.
Alternative archaeology proponents who ridicule Hawass for not knowing Zep Tepi are themselves displaying a shallow grasp of Egyptological scholarship. They lionize a fringe term without appreciating how and where it actually appears in the text, creating a straw man that they can knock down. Hawass wasn't being evasive or dismissive. He was honest about never having encountered a term that even many Egyptologists rarely see. The real surprise is that fringe history circles have elevated a niche technical word into pop cultural legend and then turned around and blamed the experts for not memorizing their lore. What do you think? Was criticism of Zahi Hawass on this point fair? Let me know in the comments below.
You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word, so feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.